Welcome back to Inside Story, where we're discussing hopes for peace in Darfur. Fresh talks aimed at resolving the conflict are due to take place in Libya later this month. So far, only one of the region's many rebel factions has signed up with the Sudanese government to a peace agreement. Meanwhile, a group of elder statesmen, including South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu and former US President Jimmy Carter, is in Darfur hoping to mediate in the crisis. Well, joining us again are our guests in Johannesburg, Aishi Kaji, Director of the International Human Rights Programme at Witwatersrand University, and in Washington, David Mazurski. He's the Horn of Africa Project Director at the International Crisis Group. David Mazurski, if I could come to you first. I mean, you were talking earlier about the need for more peace talks, but part of the problem is an awful lot of the rebel groups in the past have said they'll go and then they actually don't turn up at the last minute. So will another round of talks make any difference?
I think another round of talks are the only way out. The question is whether we've solidified the appropriate groundwork before heading back into negotiations. And peace talks for the sake of peace talks are not necessarily likely to succeed. There are a number of lessons from Abuja, from the past efforts that led to the DPA, which can be learned and should be pushed before negotiations are resumed. Firstly, participation in future negotiations needs to be expanded. There are key constituencies in Darfur beyond just the rebel factions and the government that need to be part of a solution. Secondly, there needs to be more work and more effective efforts to try to unify the rebel factions ahead of future negotiations. It's almost impossible not only to figure out who's responsible for the latest attack, but to try to negotiate a lasting peace agreement when they're as splintered as they are. And finally, the international community needs a more coordinated approach. The previous round of talks was marked by I would say overly inclusive approach on the international side and overly exclusive for Sudanese. There needs to be a tighter focus from the mediation team with limited and concentrated international support.
Aishi Kaji, could I ask you, I mean, is the Sudanese government really interested in peace? I mean, some have argued that actually it's in the Sudanese government's interest to kind of prolong the crisis because all the time that it's not resolved, they can actually continue bombing certain places and, you know, manoeuvring things to their advantage.
I would actually disagree with that viewpoint, Lauren. I think that the Sudanese army and the Sudanese government's approach has been one of containing an insurgency through a counterinsurgency that went very badly and dreadfully wrong. And it really does need to find some solution to the ongoing violence in Darfur. And I think should welcome the international community's support in that, provided that it is very focused, as David said, and very limited. And provided that any multilateral support has the leadership of the AU rather than the leadership by Western nations, which Khartoum has traditionally been very, very suspicious of. So I think, yes, they do want to come to the negotiating table, but they're apprehensive about what they may need to give up in order to do so. Therefore, they have to be handled very carefully.
David Mazurski, you were shaking your head vigorously there. You don't believe that...
Yeah. I disagree. I think that there's ample evidence that the Sudanese government is resisting a lasting solution to this conflict, a political solution. And essentially, there are two strategies that I think we've seen. One is just managing international outrage, and they've done that by, on the one hand, negotiating whenever necessary, but basically blatantly violating the commitments that they've made, whether it's with the UN, whether it's in the peace process with under the African Union, or whether it's bilateral agreements that they've signed with individual rebel factions. But the government has consistently violated those agreements. At the same time, they've worked to essentially organize chaos in Darfur. It's been a policy of divide and rule, of tribalization of the conflict, of trying to create a more complicated and chaotic situation on the ground, while at the same time refusing the deployment of a bigger and stronger international force.
And just for people who don't know, why might they be doing that? I mean, what's the rationale behind that?
The resistance to the international force, to the UN?
No, to trying to, you're saying divide and rule, kind of continue to have chaos in Darfur. What's behind it? Is it about land, resources? I mean, what's the
Well, I think at this point, yeah, I think at this point, it's a lot of it can be viewed through the lens of calculations in the upcoming elections. And what the divide and rule strategy has done is it's prevented Darfurians from coming together around under a common umbrella, whether it's one of the political movements or a common political, whether it's through a political aim, or under the umbrella of one of the rebel movements. And the failure to come together under a common umbrella has actually limited the credibility of the rebel movements. They've splintered, they've largely along tribal lines. They are less credible and less powerful and less of a threat now than they were 3 or 4 years ago when the rebellion started. Secondly, it limits the space for political opposition to emerge ahead of the 2009 elections. And so you limit the military threat that these groups pose, you limit the political threat that these groups pose, and at a devastating cost to Darfur and the people of Darfur, but one that in the calculations of the regime is less than the threat posed by a united Darfurian front.
Okay. Aisha Kaji, do you think that what needs to happen is that you have to have a sort of peace established first before the UN can actually keep the peace? Or do you think you just get the UN in there and have them there as a sort of a bridging procedure and then work on a peace? What do you think?
I think you need to have some kind of a political agreement, a negotiation around a ceasefire at the very least, and then get troops in there. But as I said earlier, it's very important that those troops are under the command of an African Union force largely, as opposed to under Western command, so that they're not viewed with as much suspicion as a Western commanded force would be. Secondly, I think that while much of what David has said is actually true, it's important to bear in mind that Darfur has traditionally been a very important voting bloc for the North, for Khartoum traditionally. And given that there is a referendum coming up regarding the North-South peace agreement, the comprehensive peace agreement with the South, Darfur has to factor into that. Therefore, this government is going to have to negotiate peace.
We obviously were talking about the kind of the peace and the negotiations. In the middle of all this are ordinary civilians who are suffering, and presumably a lot of trouble in amongst all this fighting and attacks on AU forces. There's very little security for aid operations.
There's no security at all. People are going hungry, women are being raped, threatened, children are being abducted, and it is a dire humanitarian situation, even in the camps for the internally displaced and the camps for the refugees across the border with Chad, for example. The humanitarian situation there ought to be one of concern to the entire world. However, that seems to have taken second place in the eyes of some people to the need to actually posture in geostrategic terms. You have to bear in mind, Lauren, that Darfur is important geostrategically. It always has been. There is evidence that there are huge natural resources in the region, contrary to what many analysts say. Also bear in mind that Darfur is the natural outlet for a pipeline to the sea for Chadian oil. So there are geostrategic interests at play, and those should not be discounted.
David Mazurski, what do you reckon about that? I mean, there's always a lot of talk about the fact that it is about resources, and presumably the international community can't get in there and join in exploring oil and so on if it's insecure. So that's in some ways, an vested interest for them to establish peace.
I don't think that Darfur is about resources, whether from a domestic or an international perspective. It's complicated, of course, by Sudan's broader involvement in the oil sector and China's involvement in Sudan and in Sudan's oil sector. The way it's played out has really been that China has been willing to protect the Sudanese government's interests in the Security Council. But Darfur itself has limited resources, certainly very small oil deposits, discovered oil deposits. And that actually may have worked against the international response. The fact that there are no easily identifiable national interests of the major superpowers at play has meant that the argument for more forceful intervention has really been primarily a moral argument. And I think we can see quite clearly the limitations of moral persuasion in the international system. The evidence of what was going on was very clear by early 2004, and despite the rhetoric and the promises from international leaders, they weren't backed up by action. And so the pattern of violation of previous commitments by the government in particular, but by all parties, has been met with empty actions by the international community, and there's been a failure to hold the parties accountable to what they've signed up to.
Okay, I'm afraid we're running out of time. If I could ask you very briefly, Aisha Kaji, are you more hopeful than you were this time last year, say?
I'm actually more hopeful than I was this time last year, because I think that The involvement of the Council of Elders under the auspices of the Mandela Foundation is a step in the right direction. It may not do much except persuade people to come to the negotiating table. But if it can persuade people from a broad range of sources to come together and talk, as David mentioned earlier, there are people with a political stake in Darfur who are not currently part of the rebel movements that need to be included. So there's a need for a broad-based negotiation.
Okay, I'm afraid I'll have to interrupt you there.
I think we're moving towards that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, both of you, Aishi Kaji and David Mazurski. Thanks very much indeed for your time, and thank you for watching this edition of Inside Story. We always welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email us, insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.